I never thought a single glass of wine could destroy my entire family, until the night my aunt whispered those four haunting words to me. The evening had started with a polished calmness, almost like something out of a movie where everyone is dressed in their finest clothes, the chandeliers glowing like captured stars, and the clinking of crystal glasses blending with the low hum of soft jazz in the background. The dining room shimmered with golden light that bounced off polished mahogany furniture and traveled across the silverware laid out in perfect alignment. Everything about that night was orchestrated to look beautiful, expensive, and flawless, like a performance. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too perfect. The kind of perfect that isn't real. The kind that hides cracks beneath layers of polish. My family has always been complicated, but that night, as we gathered around the long table draped in white linen, I could sense something heavier lingering in the air. I remember the sound of my father's laugh, loud, deliberate, the kind meant to convince others he was comfortable. My mother's smile seemed frozen, practiced, her eyes scanning faces instead of connecting with them. My cousins sat shoulder to shoulder, dressed in suits and gowns like they were auditioning for roles instead of attending a family dinner. Every movement was careful, controlled, and suffocatingly polite. And then there was my aunt. She was sitting across from me, her face pale, her eyes restless, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her napkin. She was never one for theatrics, not like the others. Normally she radiated calmness, almost motherly, with a wisdom that made people pause and listen. But that night, her silence screamed louder than any conversation around us. She wasn't eating much, barely sipping her water, and every so often her gaze flicked toward the center of the table, toward the wine. The bottles sat there like trophies, tall and gleaming, labels peeling ever so slightly from the condensation. They had been placed with care, centered as though they were the true guests of honor. My uncle, the host for the evening, had bragged for weeks about this dinner, about how rare the wine was, imported from a vineyard he refused to stop talking about. He called it the crown jewel of his collection, saving it for this very night. I noticed how often he looked at plates with hands that trembled ever so slightly. I leaned back in my chair, watching, absorbing. My chest tightened with a sense of unease I couldn't name yet. But my aunt, she knew. I could see it in her face. Her eyes darted to me, holding my gaze for a second too long before shifting back to the bottles again. Something was wrong, and she was trying to warn me without saying a word. Dinner courses were served with precision. Roasted duck, asparagus glazed with balsamic, potatoes roasted in herbs. The smells were rich, intoxicating, but I barely tasted the food. My attention kept returning to the centerpiece. Those bottles gleamed under the chandelier as though they were lit from within, casting shadows that seemed darker than they should have been. When the servers finally approached, carrying corkscrews and fresh crystal glasses, the atmosphere shifted. I felt it like a current, electricity crawling beneath my skin. The chatter softened into expectation. Chairs shifted, bodies leaned forward, and smiles stretched wider. My uncle rose from his chair like a conductor taking his place before a grand performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice warm, commanding the room. "Tonight, we celebrate family. Tonight, we raise our glasses to one another, to loyalty, to love, and to the bonds that make us strong." His words fell heavy in the air. Loyalty, love, bonds. Words that, in this family, often meant the opposite of what they should. He gestured to the wine as the servers uncorked the bottles with crisp pops that echoed like small explosions in the silent room. Dark red liquid spilled into the glasses, filling them with a richness that shimmered like rubies in candlelight. One by one, the glasses were placed in front of us, their fragrance rising, heady and intoxicating. My cousins reached eagerly. My parents lifted theirs with practiced elegance. Laughter trickled back into the air, but softer now, almost forced. I hesitated. I felt my aunt's eyes on me again. She hadn't moved, her glass untouched, her hand frozen on the tablecloth. When I glanced at her, her lips parted slightly, trembling, as though she were holding back words too dangerous to say aloud. I lifted my glass, my fingers tightening around the stem, The coolness. Eyes widened as if pleading with me, her lips pressed tight again, her body stiff and braced as though waiting for something inevitable. And in that moment, I didn't know whether to trust her or dismiss it. This was my aunt, the woman who had never once spoken recklessly, whose words always carried weight. But it was also my family, my uncle's pride, the toast that was supposed to bind us together. The glass trembled in my hand as I lifted it higher. My aunt's gaze locked on me, her face drained of color. The room erupted with cheer, voices raising as one, toasting to everything we claimed to stand for. And just as the rim of the glass brushed my lips, I saw her eyes widen in terror, her hand gripping the edge of the table as though she wanted to scream but couldn't. And in that instant, I knew something was about to break. To understand why my aunt tried to stop me, I need to take you back to the beginning of that evening. The first hint of unease arrived long before the corks popped and the chandelier softened every edge of the dining room into a golden lie. It began with the drive out to the estate, the kind of drive that teaches you how distance can stretch family into myth. The sun was already slipping behind the line of sycamores, and the shadows looked like tall, dark sentinels guarding the path to a kingdom that did not belong to me, a place I visited but never really entered. The asphalt turned to crushed gravel, the tires cracking down on it with the crisp authority of an entrance theme. And I remember setting my hands closer to the steering wheel, as if the car might misbehave in front of the gates. The wrought iron arch bearing our surname twined across the sky in elaborate loops meant to signal legacy and taste, but I could never look at it without remembering how it had felt to spell that name in school when teachers asked if I was that family, the one with the foundations and the annual galas, the one whose holiday parties appeared in glossy society pages with captions that made everyone gleam as if money were a light source. I should have felt honored to be welcomed back under that arch. Instead, my breath went slow and careful, not because I was nervous about seeing anyone in particular, but because I was nervous about seeing all of them together, too polished and too watchful, like a room full of mirrors that only reflected the barely heard. And I imagine that if you were a stranger passing by, you would have concluded that this was a house where nothing could go wrong, that the people inside it had solved the puzzle of existence with the right degrees, the right partners, the right wines, the right gestures. On another night, I might have let myself be lulled by the choreography of it, allowed my body to fall into rhythm with the valet's steps and the hostess's smile, and the trickle of minor talk, while the sky dimmed into compliance. On that night, though, a quieter part of me kept reaching up to tug at some invisible thread behind my sternum, a reminder that there are rooms where you must pay attention not to what is said, but to what is carefully, expertly concealed. My family's reputation for power and wealth had never required explanation within our town, but I had learned to translate it in my head as a series of transactions that disguised themselves as traditions. My uncle, tonight's host, liked to describe himself as self-made, despite the multi-generational safety net that wrapped around every venture he attempted like invisible bubble wrap. He had the kind of charisma that made waitstaff hurry and business partners hesitate. He demanded loyalty the way the sun demands afternoon heat, as if its absence were a personal insult to the natural order. His wife, Leona, had been a rising consultant when they met, a woman with diamond-cut ambition and a smile that never quite reached her eyes unless she was closing a deal. She moved through rooms like a spindle that gathered threads from conversations and wound them into leverage. My cousins, Patrick and Mallory, were both beautiful in the weary way that children of large houses often are. Always camera-ready, always slightly hungry for a glance that wasn't picked over by expectations first. And then there was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who had never been seduced by the family myth, who raised her 2 children in a smaller house with weather-beaten shutters and a garden that reseeded itself every year without anyone's permission. She was the one who brought soup when people were sick and legal pads when people were messy. She was the one who remembered every birthday but never announced it on social media. She was the one whose strength didn't show up as dominance, but as attention. When I stepped out of the car and handed over my keys, the evening smelled of cut grass and the spectral sweetness of I don't like to arrive already at war. I tried to let the evening unclench my shoulders. Then I saw my aunt, and the attempt collapsed as quickly as a thought spoken aloud. She stood near a sideboard as if she had been deposited there by a wave and hadn't yet decided whether to drift back into the tide. Her dress was simple and navy, a color she wore like a promise, but her hands were busy in a way I had never seen before, touching the rim of a plate, smoothing a wrinkle in the tablecloth, checking the clasp of her handbag, then checking it again, her fingers tapping out a private argument. At first I thought she hadn't seen me come in, and I felt a small, childish ache at being overlooked. But then her eyes snapped to mine with a kind of relief that made my throat tighten. She crossed the space between us, not hurried, not theatrical, just with purpose, and kissed my cheek, and I could feel how cold her skin was even in the warm room. "You're here," she said, which is not usually a dramatic sentence, but something in her tone, thin, pressed flat, made it sound like a plea disguised as a greeting. I asked if she was all right, and she nodded quickly, her gaze skittering past my shoulder to the doorway and then back to her handbag. "Everything looks beautiful," I said, wanting to give her a branch to hold, and she nodded again, this time with a smile that worked only half of her face. It occurred to me then that I had received 4 separate texts from her earlier that day, messages short enough to seem casual, but persistent enough to register as worry. She had asked what time I planned to arrive and whether I'd be driving alone, then followed up with a question about whether I still carried that small bottle of ibuprofen in my purse, and then told me to remember a scarf because the terrace could be windy at dusk. I had answered cheerfully because I believed cheerfulness could neutralize concern the way lemon cleans a cutting board. Now, walking beside her into the living room, I thought about the one message she never sent, the one that said, "Please don't come." If she had typed it and deleted it, if she had hesitated over it the way she was hesitating over everything tonight, I would never know, because that is not how our family works. In our family, you never opt out of a performance without collateral damage, and my aunt knows better than anyone how quickly collateral damage becomes permanent. Patrick on the shoulder, laughed with Mallory's friends from the city, and told an older couple that tonight's wine had been sourced from a private cellar that required the right introductions to find. He kept saying right introductions, as if introductions were keys that only certain hands deserved to hold, and I felt the room's oxygen aligning around him. When his eyes landed on me, he lifted an arm in welcome that slouched into ownership in the span of a breath, and I smiled, and let him kiss the air beside my cheek, because it was easier to play my assigned role than to risk being accused of rewriting the script. While he called for a tray of canapés, and launched into a story about a troublesome contractor in a tone that suggested he had tamed a wild animal rather than negotiated a payment schedule, I found myself watching my aunt in the glass reflection of the terrace door. She stood at the threshold, neither in nor out, and checked the lock with a quick twist of fingers that wanted to appear casual. A minute later she did it again on the French doors that opened onto the library. When she passed the ornamental cabinet whose doors never actually closed properly, she reached down and toggled its little handle anyway, like a person in a dream trying to secure an imaginary latch to feel less at the mercy of something she didn't want to name. If I had seen anyone else behaving like this, I might have mistaken it for fussiness. Because it was her, I recognized it as strategy. She was counting exits. She was rehearsing the room. I asked if she wanted to sit, suggesting a corner where we could pretend to admire the roses while ensuring some privacy. She agreed, but as we crossed the floor she paused near the console table, glanced left and right, and slipped something from the surface into her handbag with a motion so efficient it looked like part of her stride. The item was small and rectangular, and for a split second I thought it might have been a place card or a packet of matches, but the way her hand closed around it made me think of blue plastic and a tiny capped spout, the kind of object you don't want anyone to see because its meaning would need explaining. I opened my mouth to ask what it was, and then closed it again because the question felt too loud for the way she was trying to move through the evening, and also because Leona arrived in a rush of events, small scenes that don't look like anything until they are placed beside each other and the outline emerges. There was the time my uncle insisted on changing the caterer at the last minute, and a sous chef accidentally seasoned a platter of canapes with something that sent my cousin's girlfriend into hives, and how afterward he blamed the girlfriend's sensitive constitution, with a shrug that suggested her reaction was an overreach rather than a response. There was the Christmas cocktail party when a server tripped on the top stair and the tray arced upward and then down in a slow-motion ballet of stemware and pomegranate seeds. My uncle had rushed to comfort the guests whose suits were splashed, but everyone else had noticed how quickly he turned from apology to irritation, as if the real offense had been the interruption of his sequence. And there was the summer fundraiser when the champagne tasted oddly flat, and how he'd laughed and said the real fizz was conversation, not bubbles. And everyone laughed too, because refusal to laugh would have felt like treason. Sitting with my aunt now, I recognized a familiar heaviness gathering behind my ribs, a pressure that does not explode but hardens. It is the feeling that arrives when a story you've told yourself about your people falters, and you either mend it quickly or admit that loyalty has cost you attention. My aunt's eyes kept traveling to the far side of the room where the dining table had been laid, where the bottles took their place like anchor points in a constellation, and it occurred to me that her gaze never lingered on the guests the way a worried host's might. Instead, she kept circling the objects that would structure the night: the locks, the doors, the serving stations, the table center, her handbag. I wanted to ask her if she needed me to stay by her side and translate every glance into action. I wanted to ask her what exactly she was trying to prevent. But each time I turned toward her with a question, someone swooped in and deposited another anecdote between us. Or my uncle needed an audience for a punchline, or Leona demanded agreement about a seating placement that was supposedly sensitive, but obviously strategic. Dusk deepened, the terrace lights blinked on, and the staff shifted the choreography inside. I watched as two servers carried a polished wooden case toward the dining room, cradling it like a relic.
Fabric rested against the rectangle side, and a memory surged up so quickly I nearly spoke it. Years ago, during a road trip, she had carried a small field test kit in her car to check the quality of well water near her house after a neighbor complained of a metallic taste. She'd shown me how the reagent strips changed color when the sample reacted. How knowledge wasn't a weapon, but a light. The memory collided with the present, and I found myself wondering whether she had tucked something similar into her bag tonight. Not because she was paranoid, but because she understood that in this family, reassurance is always a performance, and proof must be portable. The seating call came like a bell, and as we moved in a soft procession toward the table, I felt the old choreography trying to reassert itself. How to smile at the person you'd rather avoid, how to congratulate someone for a purchase that means nothing, how to adjust a napkin and hide an opinion. My uncle guided my mother to her seat with the benevolent authority of a patriarch. He gave me the chair opposite my aunt, a positioning that allowed him to triangulate us. The glassware glittered, the silverware offered a polite army of choice, the floral arrangements curled upward around candles that pretended not to notice how they were being used. I told myself to breathe, because breathing is one of those simple liberties money likes to complicate by naming the brand of air. As Seb arrived and was nearly ignored, and as my uncle rehearsed for us the reasons the wine's provenance would elevate the night beyond memory into legend, I leaned across to ask my aunt whether she or something to settle her. I worded it carefully, so as not to embarrass her or alert the wrong ear, but she pressed her lips together and shook her head almost. The servers vanished and reappeared like a troop trained to, and with each pass my aunt's attention grazed their trays, the way they poured, the way they sat, the way they glanced toward the sideboard where the wooden case now stood open. And when she believed no one was looking, she eased her handbag and slit the zipper, just enough to tuck her finger and check that whatever she had taken earlier, an echo of that day with the well water, when she had told me that the most dangerous thing in any is certainty.
That punishes interruption. I did what everyone else did. I waited for the next act to begin, as if suspense were hospitality. In the half hour that followed, 100 details slid into place, and any one of them would have looked harmless if it had been encountered alone, but collected, they formed a lattice work that could hold a much heavier weight than coincidence. My uncle refused bread in a way that announced temperance, then took champagne with enthusiasm that announced control. Leona adjusted the seating place cards twice, ostensibly to accommodate last-minute dietary preferences, but in a way that nudged certain people nearer the head of the table and others nearer the service corridor. Patrick poured water for himself and Mallory from a carafe, but the server intercepted my aunt's attempt to do the same with a speed that bordered on possessive. A bell chimed discreetly from the kitchen. The case opened wider, and the room's attention converged on the bottles as if an oracle had been wheeled in to prophesy the night. If you had asked me then what I thought was happening, I would have said nothing more articulate than, I don't know, but something. It was not dread. Dread is thick and slow. This sensation was quick and needle-fine, pricking at the inside of my skin until I began to recognize a pattern I didn't yet understand. To calm myself, I told the rational story. A grand dinner, a proud host, an anxious aunt whose worry might be outpacing reality. But another story was rising underneath, the way a second melody can move through a song and turn it into a warning. It said, pay attention to her. It said, do not dismiss the woman who has never asked you to admire her. It said, notice the places where ease has been staged and ask why. Then the moment arrived that would become, later, the hinge on which the night turned from pageantry to confession. The staff began its final approach with the opened bottles, and my aunt, who had been a study in controlled vigilance, reached into her handbag with a movement so precise it felt practiced. The leather gave a small sigh as the zipper traveled. Her hand disappeared, and when it emerged, it held something wrapped in a folded napkin. She kept it low, hidden beneath the hem of the table, but I saw the edge of blue, the suggestion of a small spout, the kind of compact testing vial you might carry if you believed that truth could be determined.
A question that might change the shape of everything that followed. My mouth went dry, and my heart began to argue with my head about whether to stop her or guard her, whether to alert someone or become someone she could rely on. The noise of the room boomed and thinned, the chandelier light flared and cooled, and all the narratives I had learned how to recite fell silent as another, sharper one pushed forward. One that did not care about reputation or choreography. One that only asked whether I could stand to watch without intervening if she was right, and whether I could stand to live with myself if she was wrong. And as her fingers closed around that hidden object, and the first rivulet of wine lapped at the bottom of my glass, a desperate thought rose up. What if my aunt wasn't afraid of the family at all? What if she was hiding something dangerous of her own? From the outside, we looked like the perfect family, but that night I learned perfection is often the best disguise for rot. The estate has always been more than a house. It was a statement, an emblem carved out of stone and glass to tell the world that our name stood above others. The manicured gardens stretched in disciplined rows, hedges shaped into neat geometry that looked like obedience itself. The fountains sprayed with calculated precision, and the gravel paths gleamed under carefully placed lamps as though even light had been trained to perform here. Inside, the walls were dressed in oil paintings of ancestors who looked down with expressions of permanent judgment, their gilt frames heavy enough to crush any notion of imperfection. The carpets muted footsteps so thoroughly that you could move from one end of the house to the other and feel like you had walked across clouds instead of wool, a luxury that had the eerie side effect of making silence feel absolute. Everything about the house whispered control, heritage, permanence. And yet, standing within it that night, I felt none of those things. I felt tension, sharp and brittle, hanging in the corners like cobwebs no maid had touched. The family gathered in full regalia. My uncle commanded the room, his voice swelling above the rest, his gestures large and sweeping as though he were king of an empire instead of host of a dinner party. His wife, Leona, trailed beside him with her chin lifted and her jewelry glimmering, her smile fixed in a way that was less welcome and more warning. Their movement, another with sideways glances, stifling smirks as though the conversation unfolding around us wasn't enough to hold their attention. It was a dangerous habit, gossip at the table. But in this family, danger often passed for entertainment. I couldn't hear their exact words, but I caught enough fragments, and the sly curl of their lips told me the subject wasn't kind. In this house, everyone was both predator and prey, and even laughter could be weaponized. My uncle's wife, however, wielded her weapons with sharper skill. She had a way of speaking that dressed cruelty in satin. "Oh, darling," she said to my mother, "that dress is lovely. So brave of you to wear that shade at your age. The table chuckled politely, but the barb lingered. Later, she turned to Patrick and Mallory, complimenting them on their youthful ambition, before remarking in the same breath how unsettling it must be to live under such a great man's shadow. She smiled sweetly as she said it, as if poison tasted better when wrapped in sugar. And like always, nobody challenged her, because to push back would be to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was not permitted here. All the while, my aunt sat silently across from me. Her fork traced patterns on her plate, but she barely touched her food. Her eyes darted, flicking from person to person, never settling too long on any one face. Her hands trembled slightly, and when she reached for her water glass, it was with a hesitation that made me want to reach across the table and steady her. She looked like a woman carrying a secret too heavy for her frame, and while everyone else performed their parts with flawless confidence, she sat apart from the act, watchful, waiting, almost bracing for the moment when the mask would slip from someone else's face. It was in that stillness, in her silence, that I realized how loudly the undercurrents were speaking. Rivalries pulsed beneath every sentence. My uncle's pride swelled so large it demanded the room bow to it. Leona's remarks chipped at people like a sculptor shaving marble, her every word a reminder of who was fragile. My cousin's laughter sliced through the air like thin blades, and my aunt's silence, though quiet, was louder than all of them, because it didn't play the game. It rejected the script. That alone made it dangerous. Dinner progressed with all the grace of a symphony that sounded polished but hid discordant notes beneath its melody. Toasts were made, feeling watched. The hallway was dimmer, cooler, the heavy drapes swallowing most of the light. My shoes made almost no sound against the carpet, and for the first time that evening, I felt removed from the stage. As I passed the study, I heard it, the sharpness of a word not meant to escape. It sliced through the hush of the hallway like a blade drawn across glass. The voice was male, low and edged with anger, muffled behind the thick wooden door, but unmistakable. I paused, breath caught in my throat, heart thudding against my ribs. The word itself wasn't clear, but the tone, the venom in it, was. Someone inside was no longer performing. I leaned closer, straining to catch the sound, and in that moment I knew. The perfect image was already cracking, and whatever was happening behind that closed door was about to shatter everything. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but the word betrayal slipped through the door, and it pierced me like a knife. I froze where I stood, my breath caught in my chest. My body tilted forward in the shadowed hallway as though drawn by invisible strings toward the heavy oak door of the study. The house had been buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses just minutes before, but here, in this narrow stretch of silence, the air was different, thicker, charged, laced with the kind of tension that only comes when truth tries to force its way out of hiding. At first, I thought I had misheard, that my mind had twisted some ordinary word into something sharper. But then it came again, clearer this time, carried through the polished wood as though the house itself wanted me to hear it. Betrayal. My stomach tightened, my heart pounded in uneven bursts, like a drum being struck by a clumsy hand. I pressed my ear closer, the cool grain of the door biting into my cheek as I tried to steady myself. Voices tangled inside, male, firm, edged with anger, and another softer, defensive, trying to reason. I couldn't make out every sentence, but I caught fragments, words that seemed to light sparks in the darkness of that corridor. Secret. Inheritance. Too late. She knows. Inheritance. That word alone had the aunt standing behind me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her lips pressed tightly together as though trying to hold back a storm. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling but urgent. My throat went dry. "I heard something. They were talking about betrayal, about secrets, about the inheritance." Her grip tightened, cutting off my words. She shook her head fiercely, her eyes darting down the hall to make sure we were alone. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be listening," her whisper sharp with both fear and desperation. I tried to pull back, but she held me fast, her fingers trembling as they clung to me. "Tell me what's going on," I pleaded, my voice barely audible. "Please. I know you know something. You've been on edge all night. What are they hiding?" She swallowed hard, her eyes filling with something that looked like sorrow wrapped in terror. For a moment, I thought she might tell me everything right there in the hallway, but instead, she leaned closer, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Some things repeat if you're not careful. I've seen it before. I can't let it happen again." Her words hit me with a force I couldn't fully understand. Repeat. Again. Something from the past, something she had lived through, survived, maybe even barely escaped. My mind scrambled for context, searching through years of family gatherings, hushed arguments, and half-truths that had been buried under polished smiles. I wanted to ask her what she meant, demand she explain, but her expression stopped me. It was the look of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, holding back a tide she couldn't stop. She finally loosened her grip on my arm, glancing once more at the closed study door, then pulling me firmly toward the dining room. "Come," she said softly, but with a steel beneath it. "Act normal. Don't let them see you've heard anything." The room we returned to was loud again, filled with chatter and the clatter of silverware. My uncle stood at the head of the table, smiling as though nothing had ever existed behind that door, raising his glass in some half-hearted toast to family unity. His wife's laugh rang out like a bell polished too bright, and my cousins leaned into one another, whispering again, their amusement spilling out in sharp bursts. It was then that I realized her fear wasn't only about what had been said behind that closed door. It was about what was waiting for us in plain sight, right there on the table, glowing red in the candlelight. And when her eyes fixed on those bottles with something close to dread, I knew the worst was still coming. The sound of wine pouring into crystal glasses should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a countdown to something awful. Dinner that night unfolded with the kind of grand ceremony that only my uncle and his wife could orchestrate. Every movement was designed to impress, every detail curated to remind us that we were part of something larger, something that required reverence. Silver lids lifted with a flourish revealed plates steaming with lamb tender enough to melt beneath a fork. Servers glided in synchronized rhythm, clearing and presenting with precision so sharp it felt choreographed. Candles burned steady along the table's length, their flames reflected in the polished silverware, each shimmer a reminder that nothing in this house ever escapes scrutiny. My uncle stood at the head of the table like a maestro, his presence commanding attention without words. But it wasn't him who took control of the evening's centerpiece ritual. It was Leona, his wife. Dressed in emerald silk that caught every angle of the chandelier's glow, she rose from her chair with a feline grace, the hem of her gown whispering against the floor. She reached for the first bottle of wine as if it were a relic blessed by gods, her smile spreading across her face with the confidence of someone who knew all eyes were fixed upon her. "Tonight," she began, her voice smooth, wrapping itself around each syllable, "we share something rare, something exquisite. This wine has been waiting for the right moment, and tonight is the moment." The guests murmured in appreciation, leaning forward as though expecting revelation in each pour. To them, this was tradition, an indulgence, a mark of distinction. To me, it felt like theater. Her words stretched thin against the tension humming beneath the surface, a tension most of them were too eager or too blind to notice. She tipped the bottle slowly, deliberately, and the liquid slid out in a stream as dark and rich as velvet. It hit the crystal with a resonant note, a sound that might have been music in another context, pouring with the same elegance, her words a stream of practiced pleasantries. But her eyes never lingered too long on any one face. It was as if she were guarding herself, concealing what she really knew. Around me, the guests filled the silence with polite chatter. My cousins laughed at a half-remembered joke, Patrick slapping Mallory's arm in exaggerated amusement. My father complimented the wine before even tasting it, his voice booming with forced confidence, eager to stay in the rhythm of approval. My mother nodded graciously, the kind of nod that had accompanied decades of dinners just like this one, nods that smoothed tension and maintained image. To them, this was simply another performance of wealth and legacy, a script they had rehearsed so often it felt like breathing. But not everyone played their roles with such ease. My aunt sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tremor running through them was visible even in the dim glow. Her napkin slipped, and she fumbled to catch it, her eyes darting immediately to the glasses being filled. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She only watched, her gaze flitting between the guests, the wine, and then me. Her eyes met mine with a kind of desperation I had never seen in her before. They seemed to beg me to notice what no one else would, to understand what she couldn't say aloud. Her lips pressed together so tightly the color drained from them, and her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. She was unraveling before my eyes, and still, no one else seemed to see it. Or maybe they didn't want to. When Leona finally reached my place at the table, I felt the room tilt around me. She tilted the bottle with practiced grace, filling my glass until the red liquid caught the candle's glow and glimmered like a living thing. She smiled at me, sharp, knowing, and whispered something too soft for the others to hear. "This," she said, "is the finest you'll ever taste." The words slithered into me, leaving behind a chill I couldn't shake. I lowered my eyes to the glass, watching the surface ripple and settle, the liquid heavy and hypnotic. For a moment, it looked less like wine and more like a mirror smeared with secrets. I imagined it
Crimson, as though I were staring at some darker version of my aunt's gaze bore into me from across the table, her breath quickening, her hands rising slightly off her lap as if she might physically stop me from lifting it. I raised the glass slowly, almost mechanically, the way one moves in a dream where every action is slowed, exaggerated, inevitable. The scent rose to meet me, rich and heady, filling my nostrils with something that felt both seductive and... Around me, laughter rang out. Forks scraped against porcelain. The performance of normalcy pressed on without falter. But just as the rim of the glass brushed against my lips, a sudden pressure clamped around my wrist. My aunt's hand, small, trembling but surprisingly strong, had shot across the table and locked around me. Her eyes were wide, terrified, her voice barely a whisper but laced with a force that made every hair on my body stand on end. Don't. The single word shattered the moment, slicing through the noise, through the laughter, through the performance. I froze, the glass hovering inches from my mouth, my aunt's grip anchoring me in a reality I couldn't yet understand. And in that frozen instant, I realized something terrible. She wasn't just afraid of the wine. She was afraid of what would happen if I drank it. Her breath was hot against my ear as she whispered, "Don't drink that." I froze, but the others didn't. The stem of the glass trembled in my fingers, its rim hovering just above my lips, the liquid inside trembling like a pulse that wasn't mine. My aunt's hand was locked around my wrist, her grip fierce for someone who usually handled the world with gentleness. Her whisper wasn't just a warning. It was a command, born from something deeper than fear. I felt it in my bones before I even processed the words. Time warped in that instant. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking silverware, all of it dimmed, as if the entire room had been muffled by an unseen hand. I could hear only the thudding of my own heart and the rasp of her breath. My throat tightened, my body frozen mid-motion, but the others kept moving. Glasses lifted, wine swirled. Something else, dismissal, the kind that cuts deeper than outright cruelty. To them, my aunt's trembling hands and wild eyes were nothing more than another eccentric episode, another story to retell at her expense. My uncle's reaction was different. He didn't laugh, his brow furrowed into a heavy scowl, his eyes narrowing on the space between my aunt and me. He didn't speak immediately, but the weight of his gaze bore down on us like a judgment. The lines of his jaw tightened, and when he finally shifted in his chair, the leather groaned under the strain, sharp and abrupt in the otherwise polished silence. And then there was Leona, my uncle's wife. Her smile never faltered. In fact, it seemed to grow sharper, stretched across her face like a blade glinting under candlelight. Her eyes sparkled with something that wasn't amusement, but calculation. She looked from my aunt to me, and for a moment, It felt as though she had been waiting for exactly this disruption, waiting for the mask to slip and reveal the fractures beneath the family's polished veneer. Heat flooded my cheeks, embarrassment tangling with fear. The room's attention pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to pull away from my aunt, to laugh off her warning as eccentricity, to retreat into the safety of conformity. But her hand refused to let me go. Her grip wasn't just physical, it was a tether, binding me to her truth even when I wanted to escape. I glanced at her, searching for an explanation in her face. Her lips trembled, her eyes brimming with silent urgency. She didn't speak again, but she didn't need to. Her message was carved into every line of her expression. Don't drink, don't trust, don't let them win. Confusion swirled inside me, thick and paralyzing. What was she protecting me from? Why only me? Did she see something no one else could? Or had she finally tipped over the edge, her paranoia spilling into reality? The humiliation of being watched, judged, and silently ridiculed pressed harder, urging me to break free, to restore normalcy with a sip, to prove I wasn't bound to her madness. But beneath the humiliation was something darker, fear, a gnawing, growing dread that maybe she was right, maybe the wine was more than wine, maybe every laugh and every toast was a distraction, a curtain drawn over something poisonous waiting in plain sight. The seconds dragged on, heavy and relentless, eyes locked on mine as she spoke. And though her smile never faltered, her gaze pinned me like prey caught in the sights of a predator. The room fell silent. Every guest, every cousin, every parent turned their attention toward me, toward my aunt still clutching my wrist, toward the single act of defiance holding up the entire performance. The weight of expectation pressed down, heavier than the chandelier overhead, heavier than the estate itself. I sat frozen, my aunt's hand burning against my skin, my glass trembling inches from my lips. And in that suffocating silence, I realized the evening had shifted. The toast was no longer about family, about unity, about tradition. It was about obedience. And as Leona's words echoed in my ears, slicing through the last fragments of hesitation, I knew the choice before me wasn't just about wine. It was about survival. The sound of glasses clinking was like a death bell. I knew we were crossing a line we couldn't undo. I sat frozen, my glass trembling in my hand, my aunt's grip still welded to my wrist, the room suspended in an unbearable tension. For one impossible second, it felt as if time itself had stopped, as though every flicker of candlelight, every breath around the table, every polished surface reflecting our faces was waiting for my decision. But then, someone laughed. Another glass rose. And just like that, the spell was broken. The room came alive again with the sound of crystal meeting crystal, that delicate chime meant to symbolize joy, but which now struck me as something darker, like the toll of a bell, mournful and final. My cousins clinked glasses with exaggerated flourish, their laughter bubbling too high, too loud, their eyes flicking toward my aunt with barely concealed mockery. Patrick smirked, raising his glass directly in her direction before taking a long, deliberate sip, his throat moving with theatrical exaggeration as he swallowed. Mallory followed, closing her eyes as if savoring the taste of something divine. "Perfect," she murmured, her lips stained crimson, her expression beatific. Others joined in, the room humming with appreciation, the ritual complete. Compliments rolled off tongues, smooth, rich, worth the wait. Each word stitching the illusion of normalcy back together, each just shy of lips. She sat rigid, her eyes wide, her chest heaving as though she had just seen a ghost rise from the floorboards. The sound of her breath filled the silence, shallow and frantic, and the color drained completely from her. "What is the matter with you?" Leona's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and precise. She did not raise it, but her words carried, cold and cutting, designed to shame rather than inquire. Her smile remained plastered in place, though her eyes flashed with irritation. The silence thickened, suffocating, as though the air itself had turned viscous, making it hard to breathe. Every second stretched, every breath drawn out until it felt unbearable. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, uncertain whether to laugh it off or demand explanation. My father cleared his throat as if to fill the void, but even his practiced confidence faltered against the weight of my aunt's terror. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her lips trembling, her voice trapped somewhere between her lungs and her tongue. Her gaze darted around the table, landing on me, pleading silently for something I didn't understand. My own chest constricted, torn between shame and fear, between the desire to dismiss her outburst and the gnawing certainty that she was right to fear what we had just consumed. And then it happened. Patrick, still smirking from his earlier performance, shifted in his chair. His hand, slick with condensation from the glass, slipped. The crystal tumbled from his grasp, spinning in a slow, awful arc before crashing against the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, a shattering explosion that sent shards skittering across the marble tiles. Dark liquid splashed upward, staining the pristine white tablecloth, dripping like blood across the polished wood, pooling around the jagged pieces of glass. The room erupted into startled gasps, chairs scraping back, napkins tossed aside. The sudden violence of the sound, the sight of red spreading across white, jolted everyone from their composure. For a heartbeat, it looked like an accident, but the way Patrick's face shifted, confusion flickering, his lips parting as though he couldn't quite process what had happened, suggested something else. His eyes darted toward my aunt, narrowing, suspicion sharp as a blade. "Clumsy," Mallory said too quickly, her laughter brittle, desperate. Rivulets snaking down to the floor, the droplets clinging to broken shards. She watched as though every drop confirmed her fear, as though the truth was spilling out for everyone to see. No one else seemed to see it. Or maybe they didn't want to. Maybe it was easier to cast her as the villain, the madwoman, than to acknowledge the possibility that their perfect toast had just turned into something sinister. And then, slowly, the weight of all their eyes shifted again, this time toward me, toward my trembling hand, still holding the untouched glass, toward my aunt's grip on my wrist, toward the moment that had split the evening in two. I felt exposed, caught between worlds, one that believed in performance and one that whispered of danger. My mouth was dry, my chest tight, my thoughts spiraling. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words lodged in my throat, strangled by fear. The silence was unbearable. The tension stretched so taut I thought the room itself might shatter like Patrick's glass. And then, just as the air reached breaking point, Leona's voice cut through again, smooth, commanding, merciless. "Well," she said, her smile sharper than ever, "it seems we've had enough delays. Everyone, lift your glasses. It's time we drank properly." Her gaze fixed on me, unwavering, her words slicing the air with surgical precision. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. And in that instant, with the shattered glass bleeding across the floor, I realized suspicion had shifted, but the danger hadn't gone anywhere. In that moment, every accusing eye turned toward my aunt, as if her fear was the real crime. The crash of Patrick's glass still echoed faintly through the dining room, its crimson trail staining the tablecloth like spilled blood that refused to be ignored. But the attention didn't stay on him. Almost immediately, the room's collective gaze pivoted to my aunt, sharp and unyielding, as though she had caused the accident herself by sheer force of will. I felt the shift before I fully saw it, a ripple of suspicion tightening the air. My uncle's jaw clenched, his heavy brow knitting into a glare that could have silenced, tossed into still water, sending ripples of unease across the table. Folks were set down, glasses were lowered. Even Patrick, still staring at the mess on the floor, froze mid-breath. For the first time, the performance faltered. But Leona wouldn't allow silence to win. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hand against her wineglass, her smile so wide it was suffocating. "Danger," she repeated, each syllable dripping with derision. "My dear, the only danger here is that you're ruining a perfectly lovely evening with these outbursts." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the smile never slipping. "You've always had such a flair for the dramatic. Perhaps it's time you sought help." The implication cut deeper than the words themselves. She wasn't just dismissing my aunt. She was pathologizing her, turning her fear into madness in front of everyone. It worked, too. Murmurs rippled down the table, heads tilted, lips pursed. The tide was turning, and not in my aunt's favor. I sat paralyzed, my heart torn in two directions. On one hand, the pull of loyalty to my family, the pressure to conform, to dismiss this as nothing more than another eccentric episode. On the other hand, the raw desperation in my aunt's voice, the trembling in her hands, the terror etched into her eyes. She wasn't acting. She wasn't performing. She was warning. And I couldn't ignore the way she stared at the wine, her gaze fixed on it as if it were alive, as if it were the true enemy in the room. Her eyes never wavered from the glasses. They tracked every movement, every hand that lifted a stem, every ripple of red that threatened to spill. She looked as though the wine itself was breathing, waiting, watching. It was obsession, yes, but it was also conviction. She believed every word she said. My uncle slammed his hand against the table, the sharp sound making several guests flinch. "Enough," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You will not embarrass this family in front of our guests. Sit down, be silent, or leave." His voice left no room for compromise. My aunt's lips parted, her chest heaving, but she didn't sit. She stood her ground, though her knees visibly shook. "You're blind," she whispered.
"Crystalline."
"Really, darling, you must forgive her," she said to the guests, her tone patronizing. "She gets this way sometimes. It's nothing to worry about, just nerves, perhaps a touch of paranoia." She lifted her glass with a flourish, her smile stretching wider. "The rest of us know how to enjoy ourselves." The room exhaled, forced laughter trickling back into the air, the performance resuming with brittle determination. But my aunt remained still, her body taut with defiance, her eyes locked on the wine as if it held the power to condemn or save us all. And then I noticed something so small it might have been missed in the haze of tension, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Leona's hand, still wrapped elegantly around her glass, was squeezing too tightly. Her knuckles had whitened, her manicured nails pressing against the fragile stem. The wine trembled at the rim, tiny ripples distorting the surface, threatening to spill with the slightest movement. Her smile never faltered, her eyes never wavered. But that trembling glass betrayed her, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't nearly as calm as she wanted us to believe. That night, I learned my family had skeletons buried deeper than I could ever imagine. The laughter that followed Leona's cutting dismissal still echoed in my ears, brittle and false, a sound that tried to plaster over the cracks spreading across the evening. My aunt sat stiff in her chair, trembling with the weight of everything she couldn't yet say. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as though she might steady the entire house by sheer force of will. Every time her eyes flicked toward the wine, her body shuddered. And then, as if something inside her snapped, she finally spoke, not in riddles, not in whispers, but with a voice raw and uneven, dragging the past into the present. "You think this is new?" she said, her tone trembling but sharp. "You think this is the first time?" The words hung in the air like smoke, confusing some, silencing others. Even Leona's smile faltered, her glass lowering slightly. My uncle stiffened in his seat, his face darkening, but my aunt pressed on before he could silence her. "This family," she said, her voice breaking on the word family, "has been happened."
"Oh, what about Robert?" my aunt continued, her eyes flashing now, her hands trembling against the table.
"He died in his sleep, so they said. But we all knew he wasn't sick. He wasn't old. He wasn't weak. He was in line for—" Her voice caught, her eyes darting toward my uncle, who glared at her with such fury that for a moment I thought he might lunge across the table. "Inheritance," she finished, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Every time money comes into question, someone in this family falls ill, or disappears. And every time, we bury it under silence and call it fate." The room went still. Even the flames of the candles seemed to pause, their flickers frozen mid-dance. The weight of her words pressed against me, heavy and suffocating.
I searched my memory, fragments of conversations rising like ghosts, whispers about wills being changed, arguments muffled behind closed doors, the sudden coldness that followed each accident. I had dismissed them as coincidences, family drama too messy to untangle. But hearing my aunt say it aloud made every shadow in the room grow darker, every secret feel sharper. "You survived something, didn't you?" I whispered across the table, my voice trembling. She met my eyes, her lips parting, her breath shallow. For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she nodded, just once, her eyes glistening. "I drank once," she said, her words so soft I almost missed them. "Years ago. I knew it the moment it touched my tongue, metal, bitter, wrong. I lived, but I never forgot, and I swore I would never let it happen again." Her words lodged in my chest, heavy and unmovable. I stared down at my glass, the surface rippling faintly from the trimmer in my hand. Against my better judgment, whether from defiance, fear of ridicule, or some desperate need to test her truth, I lifted the glass. I told myself I'd only take the smallest sip, just enough to prove her wrong, just enough to stop the room from closing in on me with its accusing stares. The liquid touched my tongue, and instantly my throat tightened. It was subtle at first, like a thread pulling taut across my windpipe, but then it grew, a tightening band that made it difficult to swallow, difficult to breathe.
My cousin's laughter, my uncle's scowl, Leona's polished smile, all of it blurred at the edges. I clutched the table, my knuckles white, my breath coming shallow and ragged. And then the dizziness struck, sudden and overwhelming. My vision fractured, colors bleeding into one another, the chandelier overhead twisting into a whirl of gold and shadow. My body swayed, the world tilting beneath me. I tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. My tongue felt heavy, my throat raw. The last thing I saw clearly was my aunt's face, pale and terrified as she half rose from her chair, reaching toward me. And then the darkness rushed in, swallowing everything, as my vision blurred into nothingness. It wasn't just in my head. The room itself began to twist, and so did the truth. The moment the wine burned against my throat, my body betrayed me. The chandelier overhead seemed to sway, though I knew it hung steady, each crystal prism stretching into ribbons of light that bent and coiled like snakes. My vision blurred at the edges, the walls stretching wider, then narrowing, the table elongating into something grotesque. For a terrifying moment I thought I was dreaming, but the weight of my body against the chair, the sting of the wine's aftertaste, and the cold sweat breaking across my skin reminded me that this was no dream. This was real. The room hummed with muffled voices, but my ears betrayed me too, warping sound into echoes. Someone laughed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that turned shrill as it looped back into itself. Then came the coughs. Not mine, not my aunt's. From the far side of the table, one of my cousins pressed a hand against his mouth, his eyes watering as he struggled to clear his throat. The sound drew attention, a brief pause in the strained chatter. Another cough followed, harsher, from one of the guests seated near the end of the table. He pushed back from his chair, his napkin dropping into his lap as he reached for water with shaking hands. His wife beside him blinked rapidly, dabbing at her eyes with trembling fingers. The murmurs began, confused, hushed at first, then sharper. Chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted uneasily, the illusion of control fracturing in jagged pieces. I gripped the table, trying to steady myself, but the wood seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, worn. Everyone's worked up because of her. Her eyes darted to my aunt, who sat rigid, her hands fisted in her lap, her gaze still locked on the glasses. Panic bloomed in pockets around the table, spreading like wildfire no one wanted to name. Some guests pressed napkins to their mouths, their faces flushed. Others leaned away from their glasses, refusing to touch another drop. My mother whispered urgently to my father, who shook his head, his jaw set in stubborn denial. No one wanted to admit the truth, because admitting it meant facing something unthinkable. Leona rose slightly in her seat, commanding the room with her polished poise. Her emerald gown shimmered under the fractured light, her glass still in hand, untouched since the toast. "This is ridiculous," she said smoothly, her tone dismissive but cutting. "A little cough, a little nerves,
And suddenly we're inventing scandals? Number. The only poison here is hysteria, and we all know where that began. Her eyes landed squarely on my aunt, narrowing like the blade of a knife. A hush fell again, broken only by the ragged coughs and the scrape of a chair being pulled back too quickly. My aunt opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came at first. Her throat worked, her lips trembling before she managed to whisper, "You're blind. All of you. Can't you see it's happening again?" Her words sent a chill crawling down my spine. Again. She had warned us before, had hinted at past shadows buried beneath polished surfaces, and now those shadows were climbing out into the open. The denial clashed with panic, voices rising against one another. Some demanded answers, some mocked, some clung desperately to their glasses as if the performance of normalcy might hold the night together. I sat in the middle of it all, the room tilting, my body heavy and foreign. My aunt's gaze snapped back to me, her eyes wide with horror as she watched me falter. She knew. She saw it in me before anyone else dared to. And then, like a final crack splitting the mask of the evening, Patrick's body went slack. He had been laughing only a moment before, defiance spilling out of him like wine. But now his eyes rolled back, his head tipping, his glass slipping from his fingers to crash against the table before rolling off and shattering on the floor. His body followed, collapsing in a limp heap, his chair skipped.
Seconds, our perfect family dinner turned into a nightmare. The moment Patrick hit the floor, the illusion that had been lacquered over the evening began to crack with an audible strain, like ice breaking beneath too much weight. Chairs shot backward in a jittery chorus, silverware skittered off plates, and the chandelier's light seemed to splinter into jagged shards that threw everyone's faces into a carousel of panic. The pristine tablecloth rippled under grasping hands and knocked over glasses, the white linen mottled with spreading stains that looked, in that awful light, like the aftermath of violence. My breath tightened again, the air growing thick and chemical in my lungs, while the room tilted as though the house had been lifted by a giant and shaken for spare change. Someone screamed Patrick's name. Someone else called for water, and in the pocket of chaos beside me, my aunt rose so quickly her chair toppled, her voice cracking into the din as she yelled, "It's happening again!" Her words cut through the clamor and hung there, terrible and undeniable, and for a moment all I could do was stare at her, at the terror clawing its way through her composure and at the resolve that somehow still held her upright. She reached for me, steadying my shoulder with a hand that trembled even as it anchored, and I realized only then how close I was to folding into the floor beside Patrick. My fingertips had gone numb around the damp napkin I didn't remember grabbing, and my pulse hammered at my temples in a rhythm that felt divorced from my body. The smell of wine, once heady and elegant, now clung to everything, metallic and medicinal at the back of my throat, sweet and rotten at the same time, the ghost of something that didn't belong there. Across the table, Mallory was on her knees, her dress pooling around her as she tried to lift Patrick's head, her voice wobbling between pleading and fury. "Get up! Get up! You're scaring everyone! Why are you doing this?" Her words insisted on a version of reality where this was a prank, where humiliation would be followed by laughter, where the only cruelty was theatrical. But Patrick's eyes fluttered with a glassy, frantic confusion, his lips pale where they weren't stained with clinging red, his chest hitching in shallow, ragged gasps that terrified me more than the
Scraped with a scream across the marble, his face contorting as he shook his head like a swimmer fighting water in his ears. Dishes clattered into a mess of porcelain and silver. A server attempted a soothing tone that came out breathless and small, and another server, young, cheeks flushed with fear, hovered with a tray like a shield, not sure where to put it down in a room that had stopped obeying instructions. And still, some clung to denial, as if the shape of their words could hold the world together. My father's voice, authoritative and hoarse, boomed. "Sit down, everyone. Someone call a doctor for God's sake. This is panic, that's all, just panic." But as he spoke, his hand sought the back of my mother's chair, as if the carved wood alone could steady him, and my mother, whose smiles usually never cracked, had gone gray along the edges, blinking as though each blink might rearrange the room correctly if she could will it. She reached for her water and stopped, her fingers hovering over the rim as if touching it would declare an allegiance she could not stomach. Leona rose with a controlled elegance that infuriated me, the emerald silk of her gown catching light in greedy handfuls, her hand still wrapped around her unemptied glass like it was a scepter. "This is hysteria," she announced, sugar poured over flint, her tone manufactured to calm while her words scolded. "Breathe. Everyone needs to breathe." A broken glass, a few coughs, and suddenly we're rewriting history as tragedy? She tilted her head toward my aunt with a practiced pity that felt like an insult slipped into a compliment. "Please, stop feeding this. You're frightening our guests." My aunt didn't dignify the performance with a reply. She leaned closer to me, her breath warm and insufficient in a room that had gone cold. "Look at them," she whispered, voice shredded and urgent. "Look at their eyes and their throats. It's the same pattern. It always starts at the edges and works inward. Don't drink. Don't let them force you." Her gaze tracked the wine like it possessed agency, like it could scuttle across the table and climb into our mouths by sheer entitlement. I followed her line and noticed the rhythm of the room in pieces, the reddened rims of eyes, the damp coughs cutting through speech, the tremor in a wrist that insisted it was steady. The pattern terrified me because it asked for a verdict I couldn't appeal. I tried to stand and the floor heaved, or maybe my voice could deny it. And when a sudden chorus of coughs broke in the far corner, I flinched as if someone had fired a starter pistol. The servers, to their credit, moved quickly once panic became undeniable, vanishing and then returning with pitchers of water, with cloths, with the tight faces of people who have learned how to work in other people's emergencies. One knelt by Patrick and checked his pulse, eyes narrowing with a focus that looked blessedly practical. Another asked if anyone had nut allergies or known sensitivities, as though we could tidy the catastrophe with a logical checkbox. No one mentioned the wine. No one had to. It towered over the table in cut crystal like a villain pretending not to be included in the conversation. A guest I barely knew shoved back from his chair and stumbled into a sideboard with a hollow thud, the silvered trays on top chiming like a dissonant carillon. "I can't see," he muttered, his voice slipping out of its expensive casing, his pupils dilating wide and unfocused. His wife grabbed his elbow and turned on my aunt with a fury born of terror. "What did you do? What did you put in this idea?" The question made no sense, but panic needed a target, and my aunt, standing, warning, refusing, is always the easiest person to blame, because she does not play the game that protects everyone else. "It's not her," I managed, each word thick and sticky. "She tried to warn us." Saying it out loud cost something, and the cost announced itself in the looks that flicked toward me, calculating, shifting, making note. Leona's mouth twitched, a micro-expression that looked like annoyance snagging on a nail. My uncle turned that heavy patriarchal stare onto me as if to confirm that disobedience would be catalogued and billed later. "You're being influenced," he said. Not loudly, but with the certainty of a man who believes he speaks reality into being. "You've always been susceptible to melodrama." "Then why is Patrick on the floor?" my aunt snapped, voice suddenly sharp as a snapped wire. "Why are there 3 people coughing like their lungs are trying to escape? Why does the room smell wrong?" The last question landed hard because it was the truest thing anyone had said. Once she named it, the scent pressed into my awareness again. Vinegar tangled with metal and the ghost of almonds. The person who held this house's invisible instructions, and yet she wanted me to fix it because I looked like I might still be upright when she was not. My aunt moved first. She flagged the nearest server with an authority born not of rank but of need, voice low and direct. "Call emergency services, now. Explain only that multiple guests are symptomatic. Don't wait for permission." The server hesitated because in this house every action required a nod from someone with the right last name, and then he glanced at Patrick's inert arm and decided which kind of trouble he preferred. He disappeared down the corridor with a speed that didn't bother to apologize. Leona turned a measured fury on my aunt, each word polished to hurt. "How dare you escalate this? You will cause a scandal that cannot be walked back. This family has a reputation." She stopped. Maybe because the word reputation rang false against the coughs that punctured it, or because my aunt had stepped toward her in a way that promised she would not yield an inch.
"You will not bully me with etiquette," my aunt said, quiet and lethal. "Not tonight." A low groan sounded from the far end, and a woman slid gracelessly down in her chair, her husband trying to catch her with the reflexes of a man whose brain had not yet accepted the new rules. The groan evolved into a wet cough that doubled her, and a splash of red spattered the lace collar she had chosen because it was elegant and kind. The sight jolted even the denialists. My father swore under his breath, the kind of oath he only uses when cars crash or markets fall, and he tore a linen napkin in half like an animal, pressing it into the husband's shaking hands. My mother said my aunt's name like a prayer and a warning all at once. Something brushed against my ankle and I startled, looking down to see a small triangle of broken crystal nudging my shoe as if the room itself wanted to mark me. I stood slowly, the table edge a railing under my palm, and the chandelier appeared to steady, either because the room had truly stopped wobbling or because my body refused to waste energy on vertigo. In that clarity, I saw details that had been lost in the blurred mess. The way water beads had gathered in constellations on the lip of Leona's untouched glass. The fine powder sheen across the inner curve of one decanter that did not match dust or light. The narrative
on the last word and glanced toward Leona for the baton. She nodded once, a gesture so small it was almost private, then turned to the nearest server. "Open every window," she instructed, her tone slipping back into the cool competence that impresses committees. "And bring the carafes from the tap. Quickly." The staff moved. Curtains breathed open. Night air unrolled across the room in a heavy, relieving wave that carried the garden's damp earth and a whisper of cut grass. For a heartbeat, it felt like salvation. Guests tilted faces toward it as if to be baptized. My lungs loosened enough to admit a deeper breath, and the dizziness retreated a step, then another. Someone said, "Better," with a conviction I envied. Someone else said, "It was the lamb, because hope needs a scapegoat and meat can't sue." But the mask was gone. Even as air flowed and instructions multiplied, the fantasy of invulnerability had been dragged into the light and left there, unphotogenic and shrieking. I watched a pair of cousins prop each other up, mascara bleeding into one's liner in twin runnels, the polished effect ruined and human and fragile. I watched a donor couple whisper the logistics of leaving through the side entrance without appearing to flee, their polished self-interest as transparent as glass. I watched my aunt's shoulders square in a way I recognized from the day she signed papers alone that should have been shared, and I felt a complicated love for her, fierce, grateful, guilty, that filled the hollows fear had carved. The siren of a decision wailed through me then. I could remain inert and complicit, or I could move. I stepped toward Patrick, but Mallory's frantic devotion already occupied that space, and the server with the pulse-checking focus was kneeling with a professionalism that did not need me. So I pivoted toward the bottles instead, my aunt's gaze tracking with mine, the two of us arriving at the same conclusion without speaking. Whatever answer lived here, lived in plain sight. I reached for the nearest decanter and stopped, fingers hovering as if the glass might bite. "Don't touch," my aunt hissed, catching my wrist again. The exact grip from earlier, the same strength. If there's residue, it needs to be seen, not smeared. The logic steadied me like a hand at the small of my back. She dug into her handbag, and for a flicker of a second the memory of that folded napkin, that blue plastic, that secret portable proof, softened into sympathy for someone collapsing behind me. Her free hand fluttered in a consoling arc. Everything about her spoke soothing. "It's under control. I'm under control. You can lean on me and I will not crack." And then the illusion finally shattered in me. Not with a sound, but with a sight so small it could have been missed if I hadn't been starving for honesty. In the middle of the panic, while a guest coughed into a reddening napkin, while sirens began to whisper on the street beyond the gate, while my aunt's fingers found the corner of the napkin-wrapped test, I caught Leona's face in a clean, unwavering slice of chandelier light, and saw her lips pull into a smile. It was quick, but it was there, a curving satisfaction that had no place in a room like this unless the chaos fed her. My stomach turned, and the last of my denial died. Because there, in the shimmer and the ruin, the hostess who had told us to drink and then scolded us for feelings was smiling while we choked.
and as that smile flickered and vanished like a tell she had trained out of herself, I realized we were not battling panic. We were staring into the face of intent. The scariest smiles are the ones worn by people who know they've already won. Leona's smile still lingered in my mind, seared there like a brand when the accusations began. The room had not calmed. How could it, when Patrick still lay limp on the floor? When 2 guests struggled to breathe steadily? When coughing punctuated every corner like the beat of a war drum? But panic, when it cannot be contained, always finds someone to blame. And in that room, it landed on my aunt. "She wanted this," one relative snapped, her voice high and ragged, trembling from fear as much as fury. "She's been on edge all night." "She's the one who stirred this madness." "Yes," another agreed, seizing the chance to redirect. "She's always so dramatic, always warning, always whispering." What if she planted this chaos herself? What if she's the reason we're choking now? Their voices clashed and overlapped, embers of anger rising into flames. Guests clutched one another.
"Look at what your paranoia has done," her hand pressed against Patrick's chest, as if holding him there through sheer force of loyalty. I felt torn in two, the voices pulling me in opposite directions. On one side, my aunt, trembling with desperation but clinging to her truth. On the other, the weight of family, of reputation, of every whisper urging me to conform. And then my memory snapped into focus. The image of her earlier in the night, slipping something small into her bag, wrapped in a napkin, movements sharp and secretive. The accusation twisted inside me. Was she hiding something then? Was that why they turned on her so easily now? But then, in a flash, I remembered her explaining to me years ago about testing kits, about proof that doesn't rely on trust. And suddenly, I knew. It wasn't poison she had hidden. It was antidote. She reached into her handbag now, trembling fingers pulling out the same napkin bundle. She unfolded it, revealing a small vial, the plastic edge catching the candlelight. Gasps rippled across the table, sharp and immediate, the sight confirming every suspicion for those eager to condemn her. "There!" one voice cried. "She admits it! She had something all along!" But my aunt's eyes snapped toward me, filled with fierce clarity. "This is not poison," she said, her voice steady now. "It's the opposite. It's protection. And you all laughed at me for carrying it, but I knew one day it would matter." She turned to the guests nearest her, offering the vial with shaking hands. "This can counteract what's in the wine. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to save you." Her plea collided with disbelief, bouncing off faces twisted by fear and suspicion. Half the table recoiled, unwilling to touch what she held, unwilling to believe her words after years of painting her as the eccentric. But others, those already coughing, those watching their loved ones wilt, leaned closer, their eyes wide with desperate hope. "Don't you see?" my aunt cried, her voice breaking under the weight of urgency. "I warned you because I've seen this before. I lived through it. I recognized the signs, and I know who's responsible." Her eyes shifted, sharp as glass, and landed on Leona. The room stilled, the air quivering with the weight of her accusation. For a moment, the silence that followed felt endless. Every guest holding their breath, torn between the weight of her accusation and the impossibility of believing it. I looked at Leona, truly looked. At her knuckles white around the stem of her glass, at the faint tremor in her hand, masked by elegance, at the glimmer in her eyes, sharp and cold as ice. For the first time all night, I believed my aunt completely. And yet the room fractured, dividing itself down in visible lines. Half the family recoiled from my aunt, clinging to denial, too terrified to admit betrayal could have come from within their golden circle. The other half shifted uneasily, their faith shaken, their eyes darting between Leona's steady composure and my aunt's trembling conviction. The house itself seemed to tilt with the division, the table splitting into camps of fear and disbelief. Voices clashed, overlapping arguments filling the air with noise. My father demanded evidence. My mother whispered prayers.
Cousins hurled accusations across the table. The perfect family image, once polished to gleaming perfection, now shattered into jagged shards. Through it all, Leona remained calm. Too calm. She rose from her chair with a languid grace, her gown cascading like liquid emerald around her. She lifted her glass slowly, the red liquid trembling but never spilling. Her smile was small now, intimate, meant only for those close enough to feel its chill. "It's too late now," she whispered. The words slid through the chaos like a knife, silencing the room in a heartbeat. And as the echo of her whisper settled into the silence, I knew the nightmare was far from over. It was only deepening. Sometimes the truth isn't buried. It's sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to pick it up. The room trembled with voices, with panic, with the crashing realization that no one could control what was unraveling anymore. My aunt stood tall despite the quiver in her limbs. Her handbag clutched to her chest like it contained the last thread of sanity in the chaos. Her eyes darted between the guests, between the shattered illusions, and finally landed on me. For the first time all night, her voice was clear, stripped of tremors. "I can prove it." The words silenced the room like a spell. Every whisper died, every cough muffled. Even the flicker of the chandelier seemed to still in anticipation.
"This," she said, her voice carrying, "can reveal the truth. If there is poison in the wine, it will show. And if I'm wrong, then you can blame me for every word I've said tonight. But if I'm right," her voice cracked and she steadied herself, "if I'm right, then you'll finally see who's been poisoning us all along." Gasps, shouts, accusations flared instantly. "She's manipulating you," one guest cried. "She brought that here on purpose," another shouted. "Convenient," my uncle sneered, his face darkening as he slammed his hand against the table. "She shows up with a test ready, hoping to stir panic and make herself the savior. How gullible do you think we are?" But others leaned forward, desperation cracking their denial. "Let her test it," a woman whispered hoarsely, her voice frayed from coughing. "If she's wrong, then she's wrong. But if she's right..." Her words faltered under the weight of the possibility. The family fractured in that moment, split into camps as visible as cracks in broken glass. Some demanded proof, clawing for certainty. Others hurled accusations at my aunt, convinced her paranoia had birthed this chaos. The voices rose and collided until they became indistinguishable noise. Through it all, my aunt's hands trembled, but never faltered. She dipped the strip into a glass of wine with slow, deliberate care. The liquid crept up the paper, staining it darker. My breath caught. The seconds stretched, every eye fixed on that tiny sliver of proof. And then it happened. The strip changed color. Not faintly, not subtly. It darkened into a shade that could not be mistaken for anything natural. A sickly hue that screamed of contamination. A cry went up from one corner of the table. Someone shouted, "It's true!" Another voice wailed, "God help us!" The room erupted again, louder this time, voices colliding in terror, rage, disbelief. I could hardly breathe. The truth was there, undeniable, glaring at us from that small strip. But before my aunt could lift it higher, before she could display it to every eye in the room, a blur of motion cut across the table. Her handbag was ripped from her grip. The force of it knocked her backward, her chair scraping against the floor as she stumbled. She gasped, clutching at air, her hands empty. The handbag vanished.
I saw it, a flicker. Not from my uncle, not from Leona, but from someone I never expected. A pair of eyes deliberately avoiding mine, a hand slipping the bag behind their chair as though shielding it from view. The realization hit me with a force that left me breathless. It wasn't just about poison. It wasn't just about Leona's calm cruelty or my uncle's thunderous denial. Someone else, someone who had just revealed themselves, was protecting the secret. And in that moment, I understood. The poison wasn't the only thing hidden in plain sight. So was the betrayer. The betrayal didn't just come from one person. It came from the very foundation of the family I thought I knew. The room had descended into madness, shouts colliding, chairs scraping, hands gesturing wildly in blame and defense. My aunt's voice rose above it all, ragged but unrelenting. She was shaking, yes, but no longer hiding. She knew the truth had already broken free, and now it had to be spoken aloud, no matter the cost. "You want to know what's killing us?" she shouted, her voice cracking like a whip across the chaos. "It's not paranoia. It's not hysteria. It's the wine." Her declaration sliced through the noise. Silence fell, not complete, but jagged, punctured by coughs and sobs and the low moan of Patrick as he shifted weakly on the floor. But for the first time, no one laughed at her. No one dared. She turned, her finger rising, trembling but certain, to point across the table. Straight at Leona. She poured it. She smiled while she did it. She insisted we all drink. She knew exactly what she was giving us. Gasps tore through the guests. Faces whipped toward Leona, searching her expression for cracks, for guilt, for anything to confirm the accusation. But Leona stood as calm as ever, her posture flawless, her gown gleaming like a serpent's skin under the chandelier. Her glass still dangled in her hand, untouched, the red liquid glimmering as though mocking us all. "You dare accuse me?" she asked softly, her tone more dangerous than if she had screamed. "You, the hysteric who's ruined every gathering with your paranoia. How convenient. How very convenient that you arrived tonight with a vial and strips."
Clenched, his shoulders heaving, his face a storm of rage and fear. He looked at Leona, then at us, then back at her. And then he spoke. She didn't do it alone. The room inhaled as one. My uncle's voice thundered, not with shame, but with twisted pride. Yes, she poured the wine, but I knew. I allowed it. Do you think anything happens in this house without me knowing? Do you think one bottle touches this table unless I approve it? The revelation struck like lightning, searing everything it touched. The betrayal doubled, unbearable. Not just Leona's cold cruelty, but my uncle's complicity, his willingness to let his family choke, to let fear crawl through the veins of every guest, all for something more powerful than loyalty or blood. "Why?" My voice burst out of me before I could stop it, trembling and broken. "Why would you let this happen? Why would you hurt your own family?" His eyes snapped to mine, heavy and unflinching. "Because family is nothing without power, and power comes at a cost. Some of you were too weak. Some of you were in the way. Better to cut the rot before it spreads. Better to let strength survive." Gasps turned to cries. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father swore under his breath, his voice shaking for the first time in years. Cousins clutched one another, trembling, broken. Leona stepped to his side, her hand sliding into his with practiced ease. Their unity in that moment was more terrifying than any poison. They weren't divided. They weren't enemies. They were partners, bound together by ambition and cruelty, their betrayal complete. "You planned this," my aunt whispered, her voice hollow with horror. "Both of you." Together, Leona's smile deepened. "Of course we did." The room fractured completely then. Some screamed accusations, others begged for police, for doctors, for anyone to intervene. My aunt clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin, grounding me as the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. And then my uncle's gaze locked on me. Not on my aunt, not on the others, on me. "You," he said, his voice low and deliberate, every syllable carrying a weight that froze the blood in my veins. "You" was gone. The chandelier still shone, the portrait still stared down, but the weight of betrayal stained everything. My uncle's threat lingered in the air, cold and suffocating, but it didn't stop the inevitable. Doors burst open, and uniformed officers stormed inside, their presence cutting through the hysteria with the authority of reality. Behind them came paramedics, wheeling in stretchers, their hands already gloved, their eyes sweeping the scene with swift calculation. For the first time all night, the family's voices fell quiet, not from obedience, but from shock. Leona didn't flinch. She remained poised, her glass still in hand, untouched, her emerald gown glowing like venom in the fractured light. She didn't resist when two officers approached her, didn't protest when they asked her to step aside. She merely set her glass down with a grace that seemed obscene in the chaos. Her smile returned, calm, cruel. "Be careful," she whispered to one of them. "Power doesn't disappear just because you think you've won tonight." But the cuffs clicked anyway. The sound was sharp, final, echoing off the marble walls with a music that made my chest loosen for the first time in hours. The serpent had been cornered, her performance stripped bare. My uncle, though, wasn't taken in chains, not then. The officers questioned him, his words rolling out with polished confidence, the charm of a man who had spent his life shaping narratives. "I knew nothing of this," he declared, gesturing toward Leona with a theatrical disgust. "She acted alone. I am as horrified as the rest of you." His voice carried authority, but beneath it, I heard the tremor, and I saw the eyes of the guests, some believing, some not, all changed by what they'd seen. His power was intact in that moment, but fractured, weakened. The whispers would follow him, the doubt would spread. His empire, built on the illusion of control, had cracked. The paramedics bent over Patrick, their voices urgent but focused, calling numbers, lifting his limp body onto a stretcher. Mallory clung to his hand until they pulled her gently back. "He'll live," one paramedic said firmly, meeting her eyes, steadying her with certainty. "But he needs treatment now." Relief washed through the room like a tide, brief but powerful. Lives had been endangered, but not all lost. Whispered apologies they couldn't quite speak aloud. She was no longer the eccentric aunt, the paranoid shadow at the table. She was the truth-bearer, vindicated at last. But vindication doesn't erase scars. I saw it in her eyes, the hollowness left by years of being ignored, ridiculed, silenced. Tonight had proven her right, but it had cost her more than anyone else in the room could ever repay. As the officers escorted Leona out, as the paramedics carried Patrick through the doors, as the noise swelled and ebbed around me, I felt the weight of everything settle in my chest. Family. That word, once a shield, now felt like a blade. We had hidden behind it, worshipped it, excused everything in its name. But when stripped of loyalty, when poisoned by greed, it was nothing more than a fragile construct, one glass too thin to survive the truth. I thought of my uncle's words, his threat, his cold admission that power was worth more than blood. He wasn't in chains that night, but he was shackled by something he couldn't escape. Exposure. The empire he had built on silence and obedience would never be the same. The guests would talk, the press would dig, the story would spread. His name, once carved above the gates, would crumble under its own weight. And me. I was changed too. I could still taste the metallic burn of the wine on my tongue, still feel the dizziness clawing at my vision, still hear my aunt's desperate whisper in my ear, "Don't drink that wine." For so long I had dismissed whispers, ignored the uneasy truths, chosen comfort over confrontation. But not anymore. I walked to my aunt, steadied her trembling hand in mine, and met her eyes. "I believe you," I whispered. And for the first time that night, tears welled in her eyes, not of fear, but of release. As the authorities led the last of the shaken guests out, as the lights of police cars painted the walls red and blue, I stood in the wreckage of my family's illusion and felt something I hadn't felt all evening. Clarity. Whispers are warnings. Whispers are truths too dangerous to be shouted. Whispers, when ignored, grow into screams. And as I left that estate behind, its chandeliers dimming into memory, I vowed one thing with the certainty of blood and bone. Never again would I ignore the whisper of death.